What I've discovered is that conditions on the plantations did not improve. If anything, they got worse.
Hi, Moira.
Wonderful to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Wow.
Such a pleasure, such a pleasure.
I travelled to Jamaica to meet one of the country's leading historians, Vereen Shepherd, at one former estate, Good Hope.
Where we're standing would have been where our ancestors, especially the women, would have walked. They would be the cooks, the laundresses, the nannies, and not only did they have to be on call 24 hours in terms of the work, but enslavers demanded sexual favors. And the fact that we had so many free-colored people in the population testified to the level of rape.
Mixed race?
The mixed race, yes. Mm-hmm. How did they come about? Mm-hmm. They came about out of the violent sexual encounters between enslaver and enslaved.
Most of the enslaved worked on the estate lands, particularly in the production of sugar. Men, women, and children as young as 4 or 5 worked in the fields.
Right, so Moira, can you get a view of the vastness of this plantation?
Amazing.
It looks picturesque. It looks as if nothing horrendous could have taken place here.
This is now over 90 degrees. There is an incredible level of humidity.
Yes, and we're both suffering. Yes.
Now, we're talking about a daily from sun up till sundown.
Sun up to sundown.
Doing
yes.
What?
Doing weeding, digging cane holes, putting young plants in, cutting cane, of dealing with insects and pests in the field, and hurrying to carry the cane to the factory so that, the sucrose contents could be protected. I think within 10 years, people would be pretty much mere exhaustion and death.
Wilberforce hoped that after 1807, those enslaved in the Caribbean would be treated better. A serious miscalculation about which the captives had their own theories.
I gather there was a song about William Wilberforce.
Yes. My understanding is that they said he had the will but not the force.
Yes.
And sometimes people pat themselves on their backs and they say, well, the white British abolitionists agitated for the end of the trade, and that ended in 1807. But we're standing on a plantation that continued in operation for years after.
As I found out in Montego Bay, the institution of slavery remained in force for decades.
If you look in this case, you will see the instruments of torture.
What are we looking at?
We're looking
at tongue restraint?
The tongue restraint. This was used to prevent them from eating as a means of starving them because it was a form of punishment. Then we have the wrist restrainer, and we have the neck holder, which is really going to prevent people from moving. It shows you why it is that this model of gradualism that Wilberforce and other English abolitionists was trying to push could just not work in the Caribbean, because to wait is to magnify and perpetuate this kind of torture.
This denial of humanity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this crime against humanity had to end.
Systematic abuse continued until the enslaved themselves acted against the system. Outside the museum is a monument to the man who led them.
This is Sam Sharp Square, a monument and a space to honor the greatest abolitionist on this side of the Atlantic. Sharp and others in 1831-32 planned the greatest revolutionary assault on the slave system in Jamaica. His plan was peaceful at first, okay? We're going to sit down after Christmas and demand wages. When news came that the enslavers were not going to honor the strike and that they were going to start forcing enslaved people back to work, then they started a fire. And when the enslaved people on other properties saw the signal fire lit, then they would light other revolutionary fires. And this is how it started.
We're talking about General Sanshar. Like, amazing.
Absolutely. This was an organized, planned rebellion.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a spontaneous uprising.
The rebellion lasted about a month and cost more than £1 million in damage. In the reprisals that followed, over 600 rebels were charged and most were sentenced to death.
What's your step, Moira?
Nearby is the bell tower where many were hanged, the monument to the people Jamaicans regard as the true abolitionists.
This is indeed sacred ground.
It is for me, and it is for all Jamaicans, because many hangings took place here, many executions took place here, and that is why we really want to honor these heroes and heroines.
It seems sacrilegious, but this is a very different way of memorializing a nation's heroes here in Jamaica as opposed to the abolitionists in Britain, for instance.
And what we would say on this side of the Atlantic, Moira, is that we don't really care what is happening in England and how England wants to memorialize heroes and heroines there. If England wants to elevate Wilberforce to a position of power and say this was the chief architect of freedom, that's England's business. Here in Jamaica, we are saying these black abolitionists are the ones we need to honor.
It's been proved to me the captives were not mere supplicants grateful for a morsel of pity. They were determined. They needed, with every fiber, to be free and to destroy Caribbean slavery. And they stood on their own 2 feet.
Meanwhile, back in Britain, campaigners were quick to recognise that the 1807 bill had not drawn a line under the slave trade.
Hello there, Steve.
Hi, Moira. It's going so.
Indeed.
I met Steve Tompkins, who has just finished a new biography of Wilberforce, to find out more.
So this place is absolutely key to what's happening in the anti-slavery movement after the abolition of the slave trade. This is a Quaker meeting house. It was built in 1790, and some of the leading members of the abolition committee worshipped here.
The abolitionists realised there was a major flaw with their bill.
The enormous loophole in that was that the colonies could still buy slaves from neighbouring foreign colonies such as Cuba. So all you had to do was take your slaves to Cuba instead, and the British colonists could ship them across the sea.
To stop the illicit trade, the abolitionists wanted a register of the enslaved. They persuaded Wilberforce to try to get a bill through Parliament. He struggled to do so before abandoning the idea.
Just when it seemed that the abolitionists had pretty much given up on the whole idea of a slave register, the colonies themselves decided to introduce a register because they could see the tide rising for anti-slavery, and they thought in their own hands it would be an empty gesture and that will keep Westminster quiet. But what actually happened is that in Westminster the colonial secretary decreed that he was going to keep copies of the slave register himself, so instead of being an empty gesture it became a very effective means of knowing how many slaves are there and stopping the illicit trade.
By now, Wilberforce was in his 60s, and in 1825 he retired from Parliament. Instead, he moved to the north of London, where he threw his energies into building a church. Stephen believes it was entirely fitting for a man who valued his mission from God above all else.
So this is the chapel that Wilberforce had built on his own grounds here in Mill Hill. It was 3 miles from his house to the parish church, and that was a bit far, so he built his own church.